I felt like when I came to making of the legs, I basically like every single like 5 or 10 frames, I like paused it, took like moved the limbs the way I needed it to be, like in the reference. Is that?
Yeah, I mean that's pretty much what animating is. Yeah, I mean that is usually the workflow. Just like sort of stop every
Also,
few frames.
the arm for some reason like.
Which,
like moving.
Here? Oh.
It was supposed to just like go down. If you look at like the reference, it's for some reason like ended up like that. I can work that part out later. I
gotcha.
just didn't realize it until after I started like play blasting.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I mean it's like a rough animation. I'm not overly concerned with stuff like that. But yeah, so anybody have any thoughts and comments on this? I like the high camera angle, and I like that you've also referenced that in your reference.
That's how it was in the storyboard.
Yep. It does look like the legs on the run are like maybe a little bit sort of like slide, like they're moving across the ground and like sliding across the ground. Do you remember? Did you do the legs with a IK or FK setup? Oh, it looks like IK. I can see the handles there. But yeah, so I mean that might be something to look at. It's a little bit.
I mean, yes, I know, but like I mentioned, I had to like maybe skip a frame or two because I like counting by like 5s or 10s, just basically like blocking in like some basic what's supposed to be happening.
Gotcha.
I just don't want to like overwhelm myself.
Yeah.
How do I know which is enough, and I don't want to like.
Yeah, that's fair. Usually, so I mean, this is entirely. There's like a million different ways, like workflows for animating stuff. My personal preference is to like do the legs and the torso, and make sure that, however they're moving, they're like sticking where they need to on the ground, and they're not stretching. Because that way I can sort of go through and like once that's done, I can animate everything else around it. But again, there's like that's how I like working. Not everyone does that. So I think that going through every, however many frames and just sort of like setting keyframes is a viable way to get started. You just maybe like want to go through and just, again, like tack the feet down, like make sure they're not working, but that could qualify as like some extra sort of refining. But yeah, and then I like that when he was like sitting down where he's sort of like, he has that like extra motion in his torso where he's like rocking back and forth.
It was supposed to just like only be for like a little bit, but like he was dizzy.
Okay.
But it was like, I'm gonna cut the rest of those extra bits off his like.
Yeah. I mean, I was gonna say, so I think the motion is like a little bit extreme, but I do like that there is motion there. I think if you're going for reading as dizzy, it might. I'm thinking, so like, there's usually the thing where you sort of like, if you're dizzy, there's like, you sort of like sway like in a circle almost. So I think that might be a more sort of more universal way to communicate dizziness than just sort of like side to side rocking. But yeah. And it also looks like he's kind of maybe sliding a little bit on the walk away, but again, that could just be fixed with further refining.
It's kind of hard because like I only have like such like limited like view of like maybe it's just hard to like have like the reference image also like for the first like zooming in, you can tell it's a little bit more difficult to tell like which way the hips are moving.
Yeah, I mean some of that just comes from like, and I've said this before like the other week, but like don't be afraid to just sort of like get up and start walking around and like recreating your reference. I find when I animate, I end up doing that not more than looking at my reference, but a lot more than you might expect. If I can't tell what's happening from the reference, I'll just sort of get up and then like pay attention. If I'm animating the hips, I'll pay attention to how the hips are moving and just sort of like work that into the animation. It helps me get a better idea of like what things are doing if I can't tell from the reference. But yeah, I mean, any other thoughts, comments on this one?
I submitted a full version of this for the scenes I did.
Okay, cool. Is that was that like before, like
Yes, this was
2
the
minutes
one I
before class,
submitted-
or?
It was this one
Okay.
I submitted individually
Cool.
before Guy submitted hers.
No worries. I'll just go find that somewhere in the submissions. Thank you. All right. Cool. So I guess, is this this one? Sweet. Ho-ho. Ah, sweet. Okay.
And I didn't have a robot to key in here, so I'm just kind of like, but I have the keyframes for the camera there.
Gotcha. So,
Oh, I don't know why it's looking up.
I would chalk that up to hardcore later problems. I always find stuff like that with my camera when I'm doing rough stuff. One thing I was going to suggest with the battery is I don't know, personally picking stuff up and putting it down is like always the bane of my existence. But there's a few different ways you can sort of like set up hands for that. The dumbest, quickest, easiest way that I've found is, it's really weird, is to just have a battery perpetually in the hand and then just have him make the motion to put it down and basically just duplicate the battery where it is on the ground and then just like hide it. So at one point you have the battery sitting there, and the other point it just sort of like cuts nicely to the one in his hand that's like permanently attached in, if that makes sense. So you don't need to worry about the drifting.
Okay.
I might make a thing.
I
I might make a thing about like sort of different ways to handle picking stuff up and putting it down, because it seems like a useful thing. But yeah, cool. All right. So I guess any comments on the new animations in this, or any of the camera angle stuff? Shall I call a random person? Call a random person. Tyler? Has thoughts?
I really like that you animated the big robot. I feel like with just a tiny bit of animation, you can see a lot of like his emotions, like his frustration when he's further down and everything. The only thing I'd say is like maybe some secondary motion on the tinier robot. Like a little more bobbing up and down in the arms and stuff. And
like you said, this is just basically like a little
Yeah.
rough version.
yeah.
Yep.
So just going forward.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And then that also kind of leads me into my second thing that I usually just sort of generically say to humanity as a whole, or humanity who is animating. And that is sort of like extra secondary motion and things. So looking at, even like with the big robot, so this is like it's a weird assignment because you're animating robots, but they're supposed to behave like humans. But like, if we're looking at this sort of as a human figure, pretty much like the torso or the pelvis of a person is like never, especially if they're standing, it's never totally stationary. So it's always a good idea to go in, if you're shooting for a sort of naturalistic look for your animations, to go in and to add like a tiny bit of sway back and forth. Like think of doing something like a video game idle, but less ridiculously dramatic. But just like ever so slightly, add like a little bit of keyframing to this, and just a tiny bit of motion to his upper body, and that'll help go like a long way with only a few frames to sort of make this feel a lot more fluid and natural. I do like the thing where he's like, ah! But yeah, and actually with the flaily arm battery thing, that's another thing where, again, this is probably just like rough. I don't know if you're planning on doing this later. But like that motion, if you sort of did something with the rest of his body with that, it could make it feel even more exaggerated and sort of funny, but also it would feel more natural because like if you're waving your arm like that, like the rest of your body will have some kind of reaction to it.
Yeah.
But yeah. Cool. All right, any other thoughts, comments on this one? All right. Moving right along. All right, and this is both of yours, I take it?
Yeah, that's the both of ours.
Sweet. All right, I know I've said this before, but I'm a fan of all of the random railings that you've modeled. like oddly menacing looking.
I put some text where we didn't have this stuff, yeah.
That's fine. I do find that to be a clear and concise way to do things. And just for which Killbot is the crazy one with the like whisk arms, yes?
Yeah,
Okay.
whisk arms.
Cool. Oh, excellent. I was gonna say I was gonna be really sad if you like don't see any of the railings, but you do have some shots where they come in.
This takes a little while.
Cool. And out of curiosity, how have you found doing like the animations for the jumping and stuff? Like, has that Riggs given any issues with that, or I know like every once in a while they explode.
I think I've now made a
Not the main
version
jump,
of
or yeah,
of
not the main jump,
of
like
the
at the very end.
Mhm.
That would be easy, but getting over the railing twice.
I would buy that.
I actually did have a bit of difficulty with the railing because
Yeah.
with the big jump because the gap that we had for reference isn't as big as the gap we have for the model. So it's
Yeah.
difficult for me to at least like figure out
Mm-hmm.
how to scale it different.
Right.
It differently.
Oh, because you're just bigger.
Yeah, mine's bigger.
Mine I just kind of extended the jump. So.
Yeah. I feel like there's two solutions for that. One, which is like hardcore cheating solution, is just cheat your environment. You have total control. Just move the balconies closer together. I take it was that one with the really long.
One.
Yeah. The other thing that you could maybe do is, I mean, honestly, I feel like it. Wait, where was it? I feel like it translates pretty well with like what he's doing. Like, I don't notice anything inherently weird about it. My other suggestion would normally be make the build-up more aggressive, like make him crouch down further, and that would sort of justify the extra. There we go. And that would sort of like justify the extra distance. But I feel like what you have looks pretty reasonable in terms of the jump. Like, I don't feel like it's, wildly unnatural or anything like that. There is maybe like the one. It feels like there's a point where he's.
Jump, right? Is that what you're seeing? Or no?
I was looking at. There's like a impressively jumps across gap. I was looking at. There's like an area right there where it sort of looks like he like comes up, hits like a point, and then goes straight down. So like instead of doing like a smooth arc, he's like coming up in almost like a triangle.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah, but I assume that's just like more refining. But yeah, so anyone have any thoughts, comments on this one? Shall I call a random person? Yep.
I think the animation was pretty fluid. Really sells the character there. Really fluid. Walking around and being suspicious. Maybe that first robot that we're seeing, maybe he can move a little bit faster.
Mm.
It kind of feels like he's just like there's wind pushing against him unnecessarily.
Yeah.
Instead of sliding.
Yeah, I do think for the most part, like what you guys have looks pretty fluid in terms of the animation. The main suggestions I think I would look at going forward are sort of twofold. One, just as you refine it, add some extra, again, like shifting, to the characters' like bodies and stuff as they're, if there's ever a point where a part of their body isn't moving, make it shift slightly. And then I would also watch mostly I think like the first character you see, the not Killbot guy. It looks like a lot of times when you're seeing his legs, they're sort of like slidey, or like not slidey, but like the feet don't quite make contact with the ground properly almost. Or like the heel will touch the ground and then the foot will come down like really, really slowly kind of thing. Also watch out for IK popping. I did see some of that. And then I think with the kind of like right here, I assume he's supposed to be like running away in terror, yes? Like that's, okay. So I think for that, what I would do maybe to look at that, I always like climbing animations, I don't know why. But what I would do, I think for the running is I think, and I said this to actually someone in my other class, but I think what you have now is the unholy combination of like a stop motion walk and a run. In the sense, like with stop motion characters, unless you hook up fancy rigs, they always have to have one foot on the ground to like support them. Whereas like with animation, you don't really have that limitation. So it's almost like his legs are moving like a walk, but he's going at the speed of a run. So don't be afraid to like lift his feet up and sort of, you know, have him like flying through the air, like moving a larger distance. I think that would go a long way to make things look more natural and more sort of hurried, like he's running in terror, and also tie in again to the running in terror bit. But yeah, I mean, I think like for the most part, like it's pretty obvious from what you have, you know, what's happening. I think it's just sort of like get the rest of the animation and just sort of like keep refining things. That's like such a creepy, like I have such a creepy little face that Killbot just comes in and he's like, why hello. I have no idea what he's doing there, but it's creepy. What was he actually going for?
Well,
just like
I think he's actually about the lunge for
okay.
the guy.
Ah.
What's happening is what happened is that we were working at like different scenes.
Yeah.
And so our robots are actually not in the same scenes as you probably see.
Okay, I did notice that where it seems like there should be like Killbot was like missing from a few.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So I think that's also like something we should work on so that once that that doesn't happen too, so that we can keep some consistency between shots.
I was gonna suggest I mean, since you've been doing this, since you'd be sort of combining stuff after the fact, I think what I might recommend, and I don't usually recommend doing this, there's two things I can think of. One is take the scene, like pick one of your robots and reference that scene with the animation into your other scenes. You'd have like a double reference where the rig is referenced into the animation and then the animation is referenced into another animation. So I don't usually recommend nesting references. You can do it, it's usually fine. And then if you needed to, you could just sort of go through and like maybe add, you know, an extra little animation layer or something to like slightly offset him if he's in the wrong spot. The other thing you could theoretically do is do what am I going for? Export the animation of one of the characters as an FBX if he's in the correct location. You can bake animation into an FBX, so it'll just be attached to all the joints. And then import that into your new scene. Or a third option, which probably makes the most sense, is, to just do the animation, delete the environment from one of the characters, just save it as a new file, so you just have an animation with no background, and just import that into your other scene. It should take the reference with it, and then you don't have like triply referenced files. And then I would suggest going forward that like if you guys are going to be like sharing stuff, just dump everything in the same scene, you know, from the get-go. But yeah. So are you guys doing the thing where you're each just sort of like animating your own robot in the scenes, or?
As of now.
Okay. That's fair. I mean, I have no objections to doing that. It might also just make your life easier if there was like a scene with two robots, if one person just did both. Because you just don't need to trade, but again, totally personal preference, doesn't make a difference to me. I really do enjoy the railings, they're very pretty. But yeah, cool. Any other thoughts and comments for this? All right. Also, I keep thinking of like, New Orleans has so many really nice giant ferns in it, and I'm like, y'all should make some nice card ferns for on the balconies.
Paint. This is the paint tools.
What is happening? Oh my god.
Yeah, so this is just like pretty fragmented scenes because everyone in my group pretty much has a broken rig still.
Gotcha.
So yeah, these are just my sections.
Gotcha. Skeleton looks like such an old man. It's like it's his jaw. But anyway, all right, so I can take a look specifically at the rigs when we're doing open lab stuff if you want. I like that we just open up with the guy getting slapped in the face. How did you find, so actually, now I'm curious because it was Scalabot in the washer, but how have you found doing rotating Scalabot around like that? Did he explode aggressively, or was it?
Yeah, he did explode aggressively, so
Good,
I
good.
instead rotated the camera.
That is a very clever solution. Yeah, I think I need to go through and like modify Scalabot, but that is a good solution to fix that. Well, actually, make sure when you do that, so I was gonna say make sure you don't see the washing machine rotating in the background, because if there's like any texturing on that, or like you can see the outside rotating. So what you could theoretically do is just counter key that against either one of two things will happen. I will fix Scalabot and send out a version of him that can rotate, at which point you could just dump him in the washer and then just like rotate the master group for him, and then he should just rotate. I'm hoping to fix Scalabot in the next like 2 days, so hopefully that could be a thing. Alternately, move the camera the way you have been doing, and then just counter key, like find the rotations of the camera and just set like perfectly opposite keyframes so that the washer is moving opposite the camera at an equal speed. And actually a third solution is to just render the washer separately with basically a hole in the center, and then render Scalabot and just paste him behind that hole. That actually might even be potentially easier. It'd be really funny to have some like N-cloth like underwear just floating around with him, but I feel like that doesn't make sense for a store. Was the last clip the kid coming up, or was that some other? Okay.
The baby, so mama.
Yeah, for some reason I was actually like, I got that from the lip reading. I'm like, that's weird. But yeah, so I mean, I think pretty much just kind of go through and keep refining what you have. For this one here, it looks, or like where the, is her name Karen Bot? Is that?
Yes.
Okay. It looks like when she's, so like her hips are moving a lot, but the upper part of the body is completely stationary.
Yeah.
One thing I would do, particularly for the slapping scene, is maybe have her hips a little bit more planted where they are, and then like take her whole upper body and really like move that back, like I'm really angry. I'm putting my entire body weight behind smacking you in the face. I think, although there is something satisfying about how she's like ha. But I think there's also a little bit of IK popping, like oh god,
Yeah.
and the arm is yes.
Yeah.
I found someone else was having that issue the other day, and there was like a really dumb fix for it. I can see if that would also hold for this. But yeah, and then so if you also move the upper body, that would also probably fix a lot of the IK popping, because it would allow you a little bit more distance to sort of like get the distance between her body and his face closer, so the arm wouldn't stretch as much. But yeah, and then I mean, I think that's terrifying. So if it looks like there's going to be multiple Scalabots in this, have you guys considered a way to sort of differentiate the Scalabots from each other apart from size? Like, are you gonna like do anything texturally or anything like that to them, or?
I mean, we're trying to keep him in here for not that long.
Fair enough. Oh, okay. So he's just a stand-in
Yeah,
to
he's
practice.
just standing there.
Okay. Yeah. So I mean, if that's the case, I would maybe refine the stuff without Scalabot more and just sort of use him like, because the animations from Scalabot theoretically won't transfer over to the custom character animations. So if you're still planning on using your existing rigs, I would focus mostly on getting those fixed before going super crazy far into Scalabot's animations. But yeah, that's bizarrely satisfying. Cool. All right. Any other thoughts, comments on this? All right. Do we have? All right, so I think, was that pretty much all of them? I think that's seems to be all the ones that I have. Did I miss anyone's stuff? Was it uploaded after I downloaded these? Anything? What? Cool. All right. Cool. Well, in that case, that was a really fast crit. So next week there's pretty much just another work in progress animation. They will be due through the end of the quarter until finals. Pretty much every week there's just new work in progress. Does anybody have any questions? I know I haven't, actually, your class might be the one that I got to grade. I know I'm still behind on grading some stuff, so I do apologize for that, but does anybody have any questions about the work in progress assignments or any other sort of like random assignment-y things? All right. So just as a random heads up, I finally did actually check the dates for finals, and you have 2 more classes after this class, like 2 more weeks of regular class, and then finals. So finals, I believe, start like the week of March 16th. And then I think grades close usually like the Wednesday after, so it'd be like the 25th is when grades close. Usually I do accept resubmits on finals or whatever other sort of random stuff is still eligible for resubmits. Pretty much up through like the morning of when grades close. But that's pretty much that. So again, so like next week you'll have another work in progress assignment. That will be due week 10, and then week 10 is just finish everything for the final. So anything due for the final, don't forget, so this is all of the stuff that is just like due finals week. I do apologize that there is like literally 6 submissions for this. But it's just a lot of submitting sort of same variations on like similar content. And again, like so the robot texture, room models, all of that stuff is technically due week 10. Yeah, so if you were looking for the submissions for that, it is just in the giant finals week folder. But yeah, and just again, another reminder, if you want to submit like robot textures or room models, anything like that, if you want to submit this early, I will grade you for it early, and then you are welcome to resubmit, continue resubmitting to improve your grade. So if you finish something early and you want to like, just sort of get it submitted and out of the way, you're welcome to do that early. It also makes my life easier for grading because I don't need to grade 8,000 assignments. I realize now I'm going to have finals week, I have 40 students times 6 submissions, and I'm like, my God, why have I done this? But anywho, so that's pretty much that, the schedule for the rest of the class. Does that make sense? Like any questions on any of that? Cool. I've not actually looked, I actually don't know if they've released the dates for the final times. I would assume it's during class time, but I have no idea. All right, so like I kind of mentioned earlier, today is going to be sort of a really briefly going over some of, the tree I liked. Just going over some of the ways you can use cards, how to set up cards, because I know a lot of you guys are doing sort of like outdoor stuff or scenes where cards might make a lot of sense to use. Just for grins, I am going to go through and I want one of these trees. It wasn't this one. But I'm just going to go through really, really fast. And I showed you custom stamps in ZBrush and like how to import them. Just for fun, for a personal project, I actually like made my own stamps in Photoshop, which are just like giant leaf stamps. So this is my giant leaf stamp. So if you import that, you can just sort of, drag your own custom weird leaves on. And this is like a 10-second ZBrush tutorial. I'm not really doing anything apart from this. The only thing I wanted to mention, so by default, ZBrush is going to drag a bunch of these leaves all over your model, which probably is not what you want. So what you can do to change that and get a little bit more control is switch the stroke pattern off of the default dots and put it onto drag rectangle. What that'll do is wherever you click is going to be the center of your stamp, and then you can sort of resize it to however large you want and sort of rotate it around so that you have, again, a little bit more control over whatever the heck you're actually doing. That's pretty much that. I just had the stamp, so I'm going to use it in a demo, so I figured I'll show you it in ZBrush. I do actually want that tree. Coming back for that tree. So, cards. They're really, really useful if you are doing stuff like grass. It's going to save you a lot of polys. Must find tree. No. I went back into ZBrush to try to find the tree, and I couldn't find the tree. Now I'm sad. Anyway, so again, really useful for stuff like grass. They'll save you a lot of polys in your scene, and they're really, really fast and just sort of like modular and easy to create and update. I've finally given in and decided that I can't deal with automatic creation of objects. It drives me nuts. So basically the way, I'm just going to show you really quick how to set up a card, and then I will show you how to populate said card on a scene. It's pretty much the same thing we did with trees. I just kind of want to show you what it looks like. There's one or two things I usually do slightly differently for cards for aesthetic purposes compared to, just like populating trees on something. But again, basic setup for cards, and this works pretty much the same in both Arnold and Redshift. There's just slightly different material options that you have to go through in the setups for the materials. But in this case, again, I'm just going to kind of use Arnold. So standard surface shader in Arnold. What you want to do is go through, and if you're shooting for a glass-like effect, you would want to use transmission. This is not where you want to put opacity for a card. I'll show you what it looks like. It's really weird. And this is, again, not what you want to do. I just want to make a point of that. But if you ever, where's my actual, there you go. So if you ever, notice something like this happening, you'll know what's causing it. So by default, this is what it gives you, which for one is backwards. Secondly, you'll notice that like this is being refractive. It's not actually clear. And this is not exactly what you want. Like, you don't want this sort of fuzzy glass effect. Maybe you do, honestly, but like presumably if you're setting up a card, you don't. So again, just like a weird note about that. Break the connection for that. Do that. So if you're mapping in a card and you just want transparency on your object, what you want to do is go under the Geometry tab. And that's the same place basically where you'd import like a bump map or something like that into the standard surface shader. There's a little opacity channel, and that's where you want to put in the file for your cards. Again, otherwise it just shows up like transmission, which is not really what you want. And this is one of those other deeply annoying things in Arnold where it's like, hey, you need to specifically tell the object to be transparent even though you just added transparency to it. So just go into the shape node under the Arnold tab and uncheck opaque, and then you should have a delightful little leaf card. And the nice thing about cards is like Arnold particularly does a really nice job of like casting, the shadow, the appropriately shaped shadow or whatever for this card. It does sometimes, depending on what you're doing. In this case, it's rendering the front and the back of the card pretty much the same, but they both look nice. If you're rendering this in something like Unity, or like depending on the render engine you're using, and if it's not rendering the back side of the card in the way that you want or expect, the usual workaround, because like a lot of times in Unity, it'll render the front of the object but not the back at all. So if you turn this leaf around, it just won't show up. The workaround for that is to basically just duplicate the object and do a mesh display reverse. So you have two objects sitting directly on top of each other, and one is pointing sort of, say, to the left, and the other one is facing the right. So that way, no matter which side of the card you're looking at, there's always one side facing outwards that will be rendered. Again, in Arnold, this doesn't really matter. That's just sort of like the weird workaround we had to do, I think, at one point working in Unity, but that was also like several years ago, so they might have updated that. So that's the basics of how to make a card. You can do them on, round surfaces or flat surfaces. It doesn't super matter. You can do cards, again, pretty much on anything. Does anybody have any questions about just like setting up a card? All right. The one thing I do want to mention, I haven't seen this issue. It seems like render engines are getting progressively better, mercifully, and this issue is not so much present, at least in Arnold. Every once in, like on the older versions of Maya, and I assume some other render engines still may have this issue, you'll notice here there's like a little specular highlight on this this leafy sphere. In this case, it's doing a really nice job staying on the parts that we've masked off, so like on the white parts of the leaf. If that's ever not the case and the specular highlight is like going, you know, in the areas that should be clear, you might just need to add in a few extra maps manually to manually cut the transmit, or like, you know, whatever reflections or specular highlights, glossiness, whatever is occurring in this area. Pretty much just taking your alpha and comping it on top of whatever other texture you're using for that in Photoshop and then importing it. Which, like I said, so Arnold does a really nice job of like not having that be an issue. Every once in a while I see a render where you will get like a huge specular highlight like over here where it looks completely insane. So I just wanted to bring that up like really, really briefly. That's the basics of creating cards. The nice thing, I also have like sort of two silly texturing things that you can do if you're, I don't know, I'm really into texturing stuff in Maya and not using file textures because I just don't like creating file textures. So this is something where it doesn't work as well for this particular leaf design, but if you were just doing like a really simple leaf, you could totally map in something like a ramp shader into this. And then as you sort of move things around and play with them, you could, you know, do something a little bit more interesting with like maybe some dark green or something like that. And you can make your own textures just like with ramp shaders. Again, for this particular leaf, it looks a little bit stupid just because of, you know, how thick it is. But it is a viable way. If you're just doing some like trees or something in the background, you can do this just to get a little bit more variety into your texture, and it takes 2 seconds and it requires no actual file textures. So if it's a choice between this and just like a flat color, this is usually preferable in my opinion. You can also go through and add like a little bit of noise texture to your ramps. That'll help sort of break up your textures more. And just sort of, you know, play with things that way if you're so inclined. That's my good, weird, sort of quickie, brief bit on how to set up cards. Again, any questions on that? All right. So again, really quick, I just want to go through, so I'm assuming that this is, you know, some janky little ground plane that we've made. I'll show you how to populate your cards onto this ground plane, assuming that this giant leaf is actually grass. Cough. Imagination. So I'm just going to use Mash for this because Mash is delightful and I kind of love Mash. What I'm going to do is just move my object into the back to pretty much 0, 0, 0, so it's like sitting, you know, on the ground plane more or less. I'll go ahead and also freeze those transformations and then set up a Mash network just like I did last week. I'm going to assume that since I did this last week, you guys kind of remember how to do it. Feel free to stop me with questions. But just go through and set up the distribute node. Blah. So much stuff. Wait, this is not, where am I going? Distribute node. Set that up with the mesh, and then just input your ground plane into the input mesh. And then we should have some really goofy card grasses or, you know, something. So if we render these, you'll notice that this isn't showing up like a card anymore. It's just because when Mash does the thing where it hides the original object. So this is the one that we actually went in and said, hey, this should be transparent. You just need to go through and do that with this little Mash repro mesh that it makes. And just again, unclick opacity, and then you should have little leaves gloriously populating your random sand dunes that you've just made. So that's pretty much the basics of, like, again, how to populate things with Mash. The one thing that's a little bit different about Mash is that, like, if you look at this from the side, these are just flat planes, so all your leaves are going to disappear completely. So that's a little bit, like, this is more of like an actual, what I would call like an issue with the setup than just having your trees look like they're lined up the same direction. And there's two ways to fix this. There's one way that pretty much always works and is my preferred way because it always works. And that is the same way we randomize the trees with a random node. So I'm just going to go through, I'm actually going to, for grins, add a few more leaves to the scene. But with this random node, again, just set all the positions back to 0. We don't really want to move these, we just want to rotate it. But you should be good to add a little bit of rotation on the Y, or like vertical axis. If we look at this from above, again, all the leaves should be sort of pointed in different directions. But basically what this does, not only does it look a little bit nicer, but functionally as you're rotating through your scene, there will there will always be some leaves somewhere pointed at the camera. So this is, if you're doing something like a grassy field, this is what I'd recommend doing. Because that way, again, from no matter where you're looking at it, there's always going to be grass showing up in your field. And you're never going to hit that point where there's like, oops, there's just nothing because the cards are all flat. So that's sort of option one for randomizing these cards. The other thing I do usually recommend is turning off in your distribute node this calculate rotation. For the same reason that we turned it off for the trees. So like if you don't want your grass or your trees growing horizontally out of your hillsides, you would turn that off and then it will just point straight up in the air. That'll also make the random node look a little bit nicer. It'll also fix that weird issue we had over here with leaves poking out of the bottom of our ground. So again, that's option one for doing cards. That's pretty much like the basic setup. If you were doing grass and you wanted to do like a really crazy field of grass, I would just put like 200 of these and put a grass texture on, and then you have instant weird grass. Or in this case, giant bulbous leaves, but you know, to each their own. The beauty of this setup, all of these giant leaves is literally just 200 quads in the scene. And you can, you know, go through and like move through these. This is way less computationally intensive than doing like polypaint grass. Polypaint grass is ungodly high poly. But for something like this, so if you're doing grass instead of like a giant leaf, usually what I'll do is I'll put like a tuft of grass on a card. So don't do like one blade of grass per card, that kind of like defeats the purpose. But if you have lots of like large tufts of grass, it'll make a pretty nice lush feeling in, you know, whatever scene you're doing. Does that make sense? Cool. All right, so there is, like I said, a second option, which usually whenever I do things, it works for half a second and then it gets super dodgy and awful. So it's basically using an orient node to control things instead of a random node. So what I've done, I've just turned the little random node off in my mesh editor. That actually is a pretty cool effect. But there's, you can see it's sort of gone through and automatically tried to rotate these cards. There's three options for this, for this orient node. One is based on the velocity or speed of the object, in which case these aren't moving, that is not super relevant. Orient to mesh is gonna do pretty much the same thing. Like if you were to like take your ground plane, for example, and put this in here, it's going to behave pretty much the same way as the original distribute node would if you did not check that orient to mesh button. So in this case, I mean, you can use it to like orient it to a different mesh. I've never found a reason to do that. I don't really use that option much. In this case, what we could do is do this aim at target, which is what it was set to by default. And if you go down and look under this little aim target options, it's going to ask you to input something into your scene. So what we could do theoretically, and I say theoretically because I've made this work like 3 times and then it breaks every single time. But if you drag your camera, so in this case my perspective camera, into this target, theoretically all of your planes will point at your camera. So no matter where you're looking, the grass is always rotating to look at your camera. Functionally, what this means when you normally like set it up for the first time, it's pointing all of the cards directly at the camera, which is why instead of looking like cards, they look like flat lines. It's looking directly down the flat part of the plane. So it's not inherently useful without some modifications. But you will notice it's more obvious for these ones sort of on the end. As we turn our camera, you can see that they are rotating and they are sort of changing position to follow the camera. You just can't see them. So there's different ways that I've in the past tried to fix this. One is to like take the face of the original card and like actually rotate this. So now the cards are sort of, I've changed the direction and the cards are sort of flat. I think honestly, like that's the best way to do things. So that's just kind of like what I'm actually just gonna show you guys. I'm not even gonna show you the broken way. I've given up. I've decided to just ignore that as a method. But if we play this, so you'll notice again, all our leaves, pretty much no matter where we turn, are always going to be facing the camera. So it is an interesting way. This can be potentially really nice because it could limit the number of leaves that you need in your scene. The downside of this is sort of twofold, and it depends entirely on what you're doing. So one, if you look at the shadows of these leaves, like as those leaves rotate, the shadows are going to change position, which is going to look really, really strange depending on how obvious those shadows are and like how your camera is moving. So if that's like a really obvious change, I would recommend just putting a random node in and not doing this. If for some reason you're not rendering shadows on these, that's kind of a negligible issue. The other thing is entirely personal preference, but every once in a while, it will make kind of a strange effect if you're like scrubbing through a scene or something like that. You'll get like a little bit of like weird rotations on your objects. Sometimes it can look a little disconcerting, like as you pan across your scene. If it's visible that those objects are all rotating to follow the camera, it can be a little bit creepy. Where that actually might be useful if you were ever looking to do something like this is to do something where you have, I'm thinking of like a card audience of something, or like eyeballs or something like that you want to always be following a character. If you had, creepy eyes on a wall or something, you could use Bash and an orient constraint to actually achieve that like weird effect where all of the eyes are just sort of perpetually following the character or your object. So it can be sort of an interesting thing to use in that sense. Again, normally I just sort of do a random node. I think it's simpler. But the orient node does have its uses, so I did kind of want to point that out. The other really, really weird thing that you can do with these, this is actually a fun example where it's just hard to see things in the viewport. If you turn on the screen space ambient occlusion, you can actually see the cards now. That's usually why I use this, honestly. But now you can actually see them sort of rotating to turn and like look at the camera, which is kind of funny. The other thing you can do is if you're not using this, if you don't want to like aim at a camera, you can aim at other random objects. So in this case, like if I make this little NURBS curve here, I should be able to go in and plug that into the target. And now instead of pointing at the camera, it's just going to follow this little NURBS curve. So you could do this if you wanted, additional control over your object. Perhaps this would make sense if there's like two things that I think this is really kind of cool as an effect for. One is maybe if you wanted to like have a dude walking through a crowd or something like that, you could make the cards aim at the guy and then like everything would sort of follow and like stare at him perpetually. The other thing, if we go through and, if we unrotate our cards and like put them back to being vertical like they were previously, it does give a very strange effect. If you're ever trying to do like hair being sucked up a vacuum, this is kind of like what I envision for that, which is weird, but like, I don't know. It's kind of an interesting effect that you could maybe play with for something if you wanted to. But yeah, so that's sort of the two different ways that I usually go through and try to sort of populate things with card grasses, and then get the orientations to not look super dodgy. Does that make sense? Any questions on that? Cool. So I wanted to point out like two-ish more things with cards, and then probably move on to a really, really brief bit on some lighting. So first thing is, again, don't feel like I put the leaf on a sphere. So if you're ever looking to, get a little bit more depth and dimension to your leaves, maybe do something really like a banana tree where it has like one giant bent leaf, you can make one giant slightly bent card with like 4 to 6 polys on it and get like a really nice looking leaf from it. The other thing that you can do is sort of stack your cards. So last week I went over how to do, make like actual nice high poly trees if you needed them for your sort of more for like foreground than anything else. If you ever need background bushes, shrubs, whatever, or you're looking to make game assets, you can stack cards into one giant blob. to make pretty decent looking trees. So in this case, I found like literally just a random tree branch image on Google, and I'm just using this for the demo. So I'll go through and see how monstrously terrifying this looks. And I know from doing this yesterday, it will look really strange. You gonna render? Great. So for one, there's two things awful with this image. One, it's backwards, and the tree is clear, which is the opposite of what I want. If you guys have never played with, like, as you're in the little file node where you pick the file you're trying to use for a texture, there are some stuff in here you can use to sort of automate or like change things in the image without needing to do it in Photoshop. In this case, if you go under the Effects tab, there is this invert button. So I'm just going to click invert. Now our tree is opaque, and we have this beautiful checker texture in here from the stock image photo. Normally, I would just try to find a photo without that. If you are trying to be cheap and lazy, which I am, you can look under color palettes and just sort of play with the exposure. This behaves a little bit like levels in Photoshop. So if you set that all the way to black, you can kind of see in the little file preview like what that's doing to the image itself. But if we play with that a little bit, it kind of gets rid of that gross file texture in the background, and now we have something that looks a little bit more respectable as a tree. So this is pretty much the most basic card tree you can do. This would maybe be good. I've sort of recommended, like I know some people in my other class are doing like a huge bamboo forest. So what I recommended to them is to make a few nice stalks of bamboo for the foreground, and then just, make 2 or 3 versions of bamboo cards, and then just populate a massive forest of bamboo cards in the background. So you have the nice sort of foreground stuff, and then just, again, cards to not blow up your Maya scene and populate things in the end. That, again, however, only really works if you're looking at these from a particular angle. It does break down a lot when you're doing this. So what you can do, again, for like super cheap, dumb, and easy bushes, is just take the same card and sort of rotate it a variety of random directions, perhaps scale it a little bit differently. And this will look a little bit nicer if you have a variety of branches you're using, but it definitely will also work with one. So we have this right now. If we render this monstrosity of planes, you will notice that our tree, it does get a little bit weird around, I keep scrolling in on the render like a crazy person. It breaks down a little bit around the trunk. This is one of those instances where like, it's kind of nice to custom make, maybe 1 or 2 types of branches. And if you also don't rotate your cards sideways and you only rotate them on the Y, that'll kind of fix that as well. But it is kind of cool. I actually like the white tree. It looks very papery and kind of makes a neat effect. But you can see there's like shadows being cast on the branches, and no matter which direction you look at this from, my goodness, you do get something that looks like a pretty, what the heck? Okay, yeah, watch for stuff like that. But you do get, a tree that pretty much holds up from all directions, more or less, again, if you pay more attention to where you're actually attaching these in the center. So I've used this a lot. Like when we did senior project, we made a bunch of bushes this way for our scene, a bunch of just sort of like random plants by just taking, cards and stacking them together. So it's a pretty good way, again, to just sort of, if you need to like line a road with quick bushes, it's a really easy way to do that. But yeah, and then again, so you could also use that to make stuff like lettuce. I feel like the demo is kind of redundant, so I'm not really going to go through that. But like, again, if you just sort of curve your cards ever so slightly, you can go through and make some pretty respectable looking lettuces or other things in this way. So what I'm going to do really quick is just, what am I doing? So this is, again, if you have like giant leaves in your scene, I would kind of recommend maybe going through and just bending them ever so slightly like that. It'll make them look a little bit nicer, depending on the angle that you're looking at them from. So if you've ever played, Breath of the Wild or something like that, this is how they made a lot of their leaves on their trees, where they go through, and they just curve them slightly. So it has a little bit more range of like when you're looking at this leaf, you can look at it from more angles before it gets like really flat and sad looking. So this is probably what I would do if I was trying to make something like a fern or something like that. I would just, make a few little bent cards and kind of call that a day. The only other thing I wanted to show you guys about cards is, and it's like a weird half demo, you can use your own textures and poly paint cards to generate flowers and some other things really, really easily. So if you go into, where am I going? If you go into your content browser, like we did last week, and find Paint Effects, wherever that is. Oh, I'm already on Paint Effects. So the flowers are a pretty good example. You can also do this with Paint Effects trees, and make less horrific looking leaves for those. So I'm just gonna draw in some random dahlias into my scene. And if we look at these super tiny flowers I've just generated, you can see that basically they are just a series of cards. So if we go into the modify, convert Paint Effects to polygons, and we actually convert these to polys, literally all this whole flower is just a giant bunch of cards. So theoretically, if we went and we applied our leaf texture to this card and actually told the shape to be transparent, we now get this very, very awkward spiky flower with my horrible little leaf texture on it. So this is a way, like, again, if you wanted to do sort of like prefab flowers or something like that, you could totally use Paint Effects to do that and apply your own texture. The beauty behind this, and like this is a hideous, hideous flower, but if you went on to something like textures.com, these exist other places on the interwebs as well, but if you look up flowers on textures.com, they have all of these prefabbed flowers, and if you click on them, I mean, you have a bunch of different leaves, so you could apply a variety of leaf textures, but they come with all the channels of stuff built in. So they have like color, height maps, normal maps, all of this stuff, and also the alphas. So these are like literally built for making cards. So if you ever need nice flowers or nice leaves, see what the internet has in terms of like predefined textures, because apparently there's ones for orchids, and then there's these, which are highly, but yeah, so they exist. Again, really, really convenient for making easy flowers. That is pretty much most of the card stuff that I wanted to go over. Are there any questions on any of that stuff? All right. Cool. So a few people also asked to do some outdoor lighting. That seemed like another sort of popular thing to go over. So I'm just going to do a sort of, I'm not going to go over like how to light a scene, because I feel like a lot of that is highly dependent on what you're actually trying to light. I just want to sort of touch on the different ways that I usually would approach lighting a scene. So if you're shooting for like the absolute, in my opinion, worst way to light a scene, that is going to be, and disclaimer, I have no idea with Unity, but all of the light stuff pretty much transfers directly over to Redshift. They have the same names for everything. But in my opinion, the literal worst way to light a scene is just with a default unmapped dome light. I think that they do sort of two things. One, they usually look really sterile and white because they're just set up to be white by default. And they also give you really extremely soft lighting. You'll notice, like, if you look at the shadows on these, they're pretty vague and not really defined, which every once in a while is actually what you want if you're trying to replicate something like a foggy day where there's no, super bright, intense ball of sun shining down. This is kind of the effect that you're looking for. But these usually require, in my opinion, some modification to make them look not super sketchy. The first thing is to add color to your light, some kind of color. I'll just check on the use color temperature because that actually behaves in like a sort of real world light way. Lower numbers get redder, higher numbers get bluer. Fun fact, there are bluer lights for aquarium usage, numbers don't go up that high in Maya, which makes me sad. That is terrifying. But yeah, so add a little bit of color to your light. It's really, really unusual to find pure white light in nature without any kind of tinting. So that's the first thing. The other thing, if you're going to use an unmapped dome light, my preference is to use these for fill lights or just to ensure that nothing is in complete shadow in your scene. So basically, I usually use these like take the intensity way the heck down. And again, this is pretty much, it's not for lighting anything up specifically, it's just for, hey, here is, you know, my scene isn't totally black in areas, basically. It's like fudging bounce light. At that point, normally what I would do is just throw in, you know, a few area lights here or there. This is, again, the super janky way. Like, there are better ways to light a scene, in my opinion, but this is the sort of very janky thing that I do if I'm just trying to do something sort of quickly. I just set the exposure of this to 10. So again, this is like pretty ugly, doesn't look great. But basically what I'm trying to do is sort of replicate the normal setup of lighting in nature, which is basically like one extremely bright light, which is usually the sun or the moon. And then I'm just using this, this dome light in the background to sort of like fudge bounce light. If I turn that off entirely, you see, like, you get, the shadows are like way, way blacker. You would have to manually add lots more fill lights to sort of make these shadows not totally black. And that's pretty much the only thing I'll really use these dome lights for. They're very convenient for that. I don't like them for a lot of other things. So again, Janky Demo 1 on doing outdoor lighting. Least recommended way that I have. Follow-up way that usually is probably what most people do is just sort of grabbing an HDRI and throwing it in the background of this. Does anybody specifically want to go over how to add an HDRI in? I feel like that's a thing people probably know how to do. Okay. A few benefits of HDRIs. You get sort of baked-in background texture or like background environment stuff if you want that. The downsides of HDRIs, every once in a while, if you're rendering them, they're really, really fuzzy and low quality looking. So do make sure that whatever light you're using, or whatever HDRI image you're using is high enough resolution that if it's rendered in the back of your scene, it doesn't look super sketchy and pixely, because that will break the illusion of your render really, really aggressively. So I find usually finding higher resolution images will kind of fix that. I know like HDRI Haven, I think, has like some 8K images or something really crazy. So I would like test smaller ones and then, you know, grab the higher resolution ones for your final renders. The other kind of weird thing about HDRIs sometimes is trying to blend your background into them. If the colors of your HDRI are different than the other lights you're adding to your scene, or, you know, stylistically, if your scene looks different from the HDRI, it can be a little bit jarring. So that's just kind of like the things to watch out for an HDRI, but they're a really, really nice way to do stuff, honestly. I like them a lot. But yeah, so that's option 2, good option. The other option that I feel like maybe people haven't seen as much is the physical sky. This is available in Arnold, Redshift. I actually know for a fact that they have them in Unity. It's one of the few things I know about lighting in Unity. But it's basically like a weird simulated sky. It is plugged into a dome light by default. And if you're just gonna throw something into your lights and you don't want to find an HDRI, this will pretty much always look better than a unmapped dome light. Thing to notice about these off the top of, or just like, you know, from the get-go, they have like this weird built-in horizon, which I both love and hate. I like it because it doesn't illuminate your scene from the bottom, which is usually wildly unnecessary and sometimes can increase render times. That's why they do this. That's why this is black, so it doesn't emit light. It does also make giant black abyss in your scene that you then need to cover with things. So that's like kind of, in my opinion, the only real downside of this. But there's a lot of interesting options for these, you'll notice. So just like looking at this, the sky has a built-in nice gradient where it's like a little bit darker at the top, lighter at the bottom. And somewhere in this scene, I have where is it? Somewhere in the scene, there's a tiny sun. No, there's a tiny sun in here. So you do have lots of options. If you want, you can change the size of the sun. Mostly, I guess, for aesthetic purposes. I don't think it really changes the lighting all that much, honestly. But there's a bunch of other stuff that you can play with that's pretty cool. You can play with the elevation of the sun. So if you're looking to, animate like a sunset or something like that, you could just put a few keyframes on this and have like built-in sunset. You can change the direction of the sun in the sky. That's this azimuth setting? I have no idea how you say that, but it's basically like rotating your sky dome light. That's how you do it. And then there's also like a bunch of other crazy options in here. Usually I just sort of like scrub through things and see what they do. You can play with turbidity. Honestly, I'm not really sure how to describe this. It seems just to be sort of like adding a layer of fog to the sky where this light is like more diffused throughout the scene. Yeah.
Do you have any like redshift device for
So Redshift has a physical sky.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, it behaves pretty much exactly this. Well, it behaves pretty much the same way. The settings are all really similar, and you should be able to do pretty much all of this stuff in the Redshift one. They might just be called different things. Honestly, physical sky is one of those things I just sort of play with things. I'm like, what does this button do? And then that's how I figure stuff out. But yes, all of this lighting stuff does transfer into Redshift, and this one even does to Unity too, which is exciting. But yes, you can play with all of these different settings. You can change the intensity of your light if you need it blinding for some reason. And you can also, if you're so inclined, okay, that was bad. One thing that is really cool is this will sort of simulate sunsets. So if we take the sky, or if we take the sun really, really low in the sky, you'll notice the whole thing ends up getting a lot oranger. And eventually it will just sort of fade to like the end of sunset with like a totally black sky at the top. So again, really, really handy if you do need to mess with like the passage of time. You'll also notice that as we change the elevation of the sky, it's also updating the shadows on the ground. So again, very, very convenient for passage of time nonsense. Other two things to be aware of, you can turn off the sun if you want. At this point, it pretty much behaves, in my opinion, more or less like you lose the main source of light, but you still get the sort of bounce light from the overall sky as a whole. If you want to, you can change basically the color of the light and the shadows. So if we change the sun tint to this horrible, horrible pink color, let me actually rotate. I want some more aggressive shadows. Sure. So if we change the sun tint, pretty much anything the sun hits is going to be a little bit of like this pinky color. Or where was it? It was intensity? I'm trying to like make a point with this, which worked much better yesterday. Oh, whoops, my bad. All right, so sky tint is pink. If we change the sun tint to something like bright green, this is what I was actually looking for. So at this point, anything the sun hits is going to have this green tint to it. And then anything that is just sort of like bounce light from the sky, so like functionally, usually just the shadows, it'll sort of tweak that shadow color. So this is something where if you have, an HDRI or something like that in your background, or you were trying to sort of like capture like a more sort of like faded blue look to your shadows, you could play basically with the sky tint, and that's going to tint your shadows from being less like solid black or solid blue. That's, I think, actually really the power of the default physical sky is the fact that you get that extra bounce light, so everything isn't just black and white with your lighting. But yeah, I mean, that's pretty much the physical sky. Does anybody have any questions about that?
Yeah.
Yep.
Does it just work with daylight, or can it also simulate night with it, or can you?
So honestly, I've never super tried it. Theoretically, you would be able to. So like if you basically switch the sun to be a moon, and then for doing night, I would probably go through and like take the intensity down significantly. And you could sort of go through a combination of maybe like intensity with the lights and playing with the tint of the sky, so that maybe you were pushing in some kind of a little bit of like a bluer color or something like that into your scene. Not that blue. But yeah, I mean, honestly, I've never tried it to do like a hardcore night effect. What am I doing? The other thing that it seems like you could probably do is, and again, this works a little bit better for sunset specifically, is it will give you a sort of very muted, like orangey effect here. If you change, theoretically, the color of the sun to be something a little bit like less intense orangey, it might give you can't even see that on the projector. It might give you something that would appear to be slightly more nightish of an effect. But I think that's still more sunset. Honestly, I'm sure there's a way to do it. I've just never tried it.
If that's the case, is there like another way to like really do like a night outdoorsy scene without using physical sky?
You can use an HDRI if you can find one. The other thing you can do, which I have, disclaimer, never tried doing, is apparently you can draw your own HDRIs. So if you didn't like any of the night ones, you can make your own with just some dots in Photoshop or something. Honestly though, if you can't do it with a physical sky and you couldn't find, like I know a lot of people struggle finding good night HDRIs, you could just sort of do like a light setup with area lights or something like that if you had to sort of force it. Alternately, you guys are doing like the sort of Louisiana thing.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in that case, what I would suggest, like, I was thinking you were doing like a giant field or something like that, and I'm like, ugh. If you're in Louisiana, I think you can get away with doing most of your lighting through local lights on buildings, like street lamps, stuff like that, instead of doing like a hardcore night sky. Like at that point, the moon's light compared to light generated from a city is almost negligible. So that what you do in the very background for like an HDRI or whatever probably isn't going to have that much effect on your lighting. The only thing maybe where you'd want that is
For reflections.
yeah, like for reflections, definitely, especially if you're having any like wet puddles or something like that. But maybe if you're, looking around a corner and there's not a lot of lighting, you would want just like, and again, you could fudge this with just like an area light or something like that. Put a disc area light in your sky and just like make it very unintense. Just like fudge it with area lights, but like you get that sort of like blue reflection or whatever from like the moon or the night light coming in to the sort of like orangey glow of the city.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, honestly, I've not played with night lighting of fields that much. Usually I do just sort of fudge it with area lights if I have to do it. But yeah. Any other questions on stuff? All right. So that is, I think, pretty much mostly my bit on lighting things. I have two more strange little tidbits that I just wanted to really quick go over, and that is one, if you need, so this is just like a silly dumb note. If you are making area lights in Arnold, you can change their shape. So from quad to something like a cylinder or a disc if you want to. I don't find usually I just sort of leave it rectangular. Disc, like I said, could sort of be substituted in for the moon. And then theoretically, if you found like a picture of the moon, you could put it in for color and you'd get like a little bit of like the moon's lumpiness or something like that. Again, functionally, I don't really do this all that much. Redshift does have a nice feature if you are trying to recreate this default like crappy spotlight from the Maya default lighting, which for the record you should not be using to light your scenes. Redshift has an option where you can turn an area light into this shape. I wish Arnold did, but Redshift does, so I don't know. I just sort of like that about Redshift, and I figured I'd bring it up. The only other thing that I actually want to go over is there's a common issue, not so much with outdoor scenes, but with indoor ones that I see somewhat frequently. So basically, you have this lovely cube of a room, and you're just, hanging out in here, and you're trying to like render the corner of this room, which I'm gonna stretch so I can actually get inside it. So you're trying to like render the corner of this room with a tree in it. Usually what happens if you're rendering the inside of a space like this and you're using something like a an area light or like not an area light, a sky dome light, HDRI, physical sky, anything like that. Usually it takes a really, really long time to render, and it also renders extremely sampley. And there's an easy fix for that. I know I mentioned it in my previous classes. I just want to sort of bring it up again really quickly. But basically, if you're rendering any kind of indoor scene, why is it every time I try to set this up, it doesn't? Okay, bump the intensity of this light up lots. Great. All right, very, very bright sky. There we go. So it usually takes a while to render, and you'll notice a lot of sampling issues. So like if we look in here, especially for the bounce light, can you guys see that? Cool. It's very sampley, it looks really gross. In this case, it only took 3 seconds to render this image, which is kind of annoyingly fast for my purposes, but this one should take a little bit longer maybe to render. But basically, no matter how high you bump up the sampling for your lighting, like it always looks really sampley. And the reason that that happens when you're using something like any kind of like the sort of global like dome lights over an area light is because shadows are very, very computationally intensive for Maya or any rendering engine to render. And what this is basically doing in a closed environment like a bedroom with a window, it's also rendering the light that's coming into the back, like all of the walls, the floor, the ceiling. It's calculating all of that light when it doesn't really need to be, because all you really care about is the light coming directly through this window. But Maya doesn't know that if this is the setup you have, basically a box with a hole in it and just like a dome light. The fix for this is to use a portal light, or a light portal. So again, they have these in both Arnold and Redshift. But basically, what this is just sort of telling Maya, like, hey, point your light, or like only pay attention to the light in this particular area. It's one of the few lights that I find resizing it doesn't actually hurt the light. But you just kind of like make it the size of whatever, window, door opening you have in your room. Pop it in kind of close to the door, and it should help increase render quality and speeds. Also, fun fact, Alt-Z will undo your last camera move in case that is the thing you need to do. Weird, just helpful thing. So, theoretically, if we go through and say re-render like this patch of room, now with this portal light, it should theoretically, it should do one of two things. It should theoretically render faster and look better. In this case, it happens to be, this is literally never happened except for today's demo and the one I did yesterday. The bounce light looks worse, but you'll notice the floor does actually look pretty significantly better. So here's with the portal light and here's without the portal light. So it can help reduce sampling in that sense. The bounce light is something you'd probably have to go in and play with a combination of light sampling and maybe the bounces for your global illumination. But in general, portal lights will speed things up and make them look better for most of the render. So, I mean, same 3 seconds, but you do get a higher quality render from it. You don't need to boost your samples super crazy high. That's pretty much my weird bit on portal lights. If you are ever having that sampling issue, try putting in portal lights. Usually it will help solve that, and then sort of you can play with samplings from there. Any questions on that? All right, cool. So I think, let me double check my notes to make sure I'm not lying to you, but I think I had like one more really silly demo for you, and that is the one other thing that I really, really like doing with cards. I'm kind of fanatical about my cards. But basically, you can make cards into clouds. So if you're ever trying to do like a desert or something like that with some clouds rolling through the sky, you can do that very, very easily with cards. It's extremely cheap. It requires no simulation, which is always nice. And pretty much unless you're doing something like How to Train Your Dragon, where you need to be flying through the middle of a volumetric cloud and like interacting with it, this is gonna work totally fine. So this is something that you could do. I found this, again, generic. I found this cloud texture online. It had some weird purple color to it, so I just made it black and white in Photoshop for the alpha. And I'm just going to go through and, where am I going? Make it opaque, or make it not opaque, as Maya demands. And you can see, I mean, it's not like, it's a weirdly shaped cloud, but like, it's a pretty decent looking cloud, and it'll hold up if you put it over something like a physical sky. So if you are using a physical sky and you do want to customize it with, you know, some interesting clouds or something like that, you can totally do that with cards. And the benefit of using cards for something like this is you're able to very, very easily go through if you want. You can stack your cards to give things a little bit more depth and interest. And you can also, if you've ever just like hung out outside and watched clouds move, which sounds really stupid, some of them, you'll notice there's like layers of clouds and some move faster than others. So you can actually just sort of like very easily like keyframe batches of clouds to sort of shift faster than others, or do like different types of clouds, whatever. But it's a really, again, cheap and easy way to make your textures look a little bit nicer. These will also cast shadows on the ground. I probably don't have a ground plane set up in any useful place to look at that. But it can also make things a little bit more interesting with your lighting. And you can also, once again, texture these with default Maya textures. So this is just a white cloud right now. 2-second way to make this look way more interesting is going in and mapping in a ramp texture like I did before. And you'll notice, like, as I play with this, the top of the cloud and the bottom, so you can like make these kind of like fake shadows on your clouds, which can be kind of interesting. A little bit more interesting than just sort of like the default cloud color. And if you were doing some kind of weird sunset lighting or something like that, you could make this, like, you could make the bottom of the cloud this sort of like angry purpley color and push something a little bit punchier into the top, maybe like a yellow or something like that. So again, quick and easy way to sort of like recolor your clouds if you need to. The other thing you can do, I'm a little bit obsessed with ramp textures in case you can't tell. You can map ramp textures several ramps deep, or put other things into your ramp textures. So you can like throw a noise texture into this yellow, and that's going to make the cloud look a little bit sort of puffy if you're trying to sort of recreate that effect there. So you can mess with your clouds that way and just do something, you know, a little bit more interesting. It takes 2 seconds in Maya, and it'll actually, if you'll notice, like if you're looking at the ramp texture itself, you can see that like that noise anywhere that there was yellow is now a noise texture, and it's just sort of fading gently into this hideous purple that I've added in here. So in like, you know, a few mouse buttons, like a minute and a half, I've made like a decent looking texture for these clouds to make them a little bit more sort of visually interesting from afar, even if the purple is horrible and aggressive. But yeah, I think that's like pretty much my bit on lighting and outdoor stuff in general and cards. Does anybody have any questions about any of that stuff? All right, cool. Any questions about anything else? All right. In that case, I think every time I do this lecture, I get faster. So that was actually pretty much all I had for you guys today. There was, actually, sorry, I lied. There is one tiny thing that I did want to go over. Someone asked about it in my other class. I might do a more comprehensive guide to that at some other point. But somebody asked, can you render, if you have, say, you're rendering 100 frames and you have 3 cameras, is there a way to hit render once and have it render the correct frames from all your cameras? The answer to that is yes. I think there's a few different ways to do it. The one that I'm most familiar with is using render layers. And you can use these for a few other things. So I'll probably do a little, like a short demo on these in upcoming classes. But basically what you want to do is go into your Windows rendering editors and render setup. There's also a little button for it over here right next to the hypershade. But if you guys are familiar with display layers or you've played with animation layers, this works in a similar sort of setup. So by default, this is what's going to show up in the render setup window. You have this scene is basically your master layer. It shows you everything in your scene. For the most part, you can't really edit this. It's literally just, hey, here's everything in your Maya file. You can add custom layers to this, and this is, in this case, what we're going to do. And that's just this little create a render layer button. So make your layer. I'll just call this camera 1. And to actually add anything to this layer and make it do anything useful, you need to right-click and create a collection in this layer. This is going to be basically a collection of stuff that you're adding into this layer. I usually am too lazy to name these, but anything that you want to actually show up in this layer must be added into this collection or another collection under this layer. You can make multiples. So right now we're looking at the master layer. You can tell by the little blue icons highlighted. If we look at our camera 1 layer, you'll see that apart from the light, which sometimes shows up and sometimes doesn't, there's nothing actually added in this layer. Like, all our geometry is gone. It's not actually gone, it's still in your scene, it's just not added to this layer. So if you want something to be rendered in this layer, you do need to select all of your objects and then just drag them into this collection thing. They should show up, and then you would be able to render it. So that is important. Don't forget stuff. If you add something to one layer and you need it to show up across all of your cameras, don't forget to add it to the rest of things. I've done that before, and then I have to go back and like re-render parts of things. But what I'm going to do, so that's our first layer. I'm just going to make another one called Cam2. And again, just create a collection in there and just drag in all of the stuff from your scene. Does anybody have any questions about that? Like, does that make sense how to set these up? All right. So you can do weird stuff. Like, I use these a lot for corrective rendering, where it's like, oops, I rendered a thing wrong, or like, I forgot to render a thing. I'll set up a separate render layer. You can do stuff like assigning different textures to the same object based on the render layer. So sometimes I'll do that. I'll probably do a bit on that in the future. But this is basically the setup with render layers that you need in order to actually start rendering, sort of like auto-rendering different frames. So I am actually just going to add really quickly an extra camera into the scene. I will make this camera staring, I don't know, somewhere closer to the ground. I don't know what this is actually looking at, whatever. So to actually set this up to render in the way that we want, go into your render settings, and you'll notice up here, if you've ever actually looked at the render layer up here, normally it's set to master layer by default. So this is the default render layer here. It just has all of your stuff in the Maya scene. Once we add layers, they will show up in this render layer dropdown, and you will be able to select them and do other fun things to them. So I'm just going to grab camera 1. I'll grab that layer. If you want to, you can set different settings for your renders. I've never found that useful. But in this case, what we want to do is basically mess with the start and end frame of each of these render layers. So if you just sort of right-click on the text of this start frame, it's going to ask, do you want to do an absolute or relative override? It's going to give you these little options now that you have extra render layers in there. So I'm just going to go ahead and do, honestly, I always forget if it's absolute or relative for this, so I'm just going to do absolute. But once you select any kind of override, it's going to highlight your setting and make it bright orange. This is basically saying, hey, whatever you enter in here is going to be different than the previous, or like any other render layers. Like, this is a custom setting for this layer only. So we'll enter frame 1 here, and then just do maybe like frame 3. And you can also swap the renderable cameras. So in this case, I'll render from my perspective camera. And that should be good for the setup of the render layer 1. Obviously for this, you can make these frames whatever you want. That makes sense with whatever you're trying to actually render. So if we go up to camera layer 2, you'll notice that all of those overrides have disappeared because they were only set for layer 1. So for this, we just need to do the exact same thing. I'll just do frame 4 to frame 6. Great. And again, just do a override here, and this one I will render from camera 1. I should actually make sure, I'm not sure if I put camera 1 in my scene, so I'm just gonna dump that in there to be safe. There we go. All right, cool. And just double check this. Sometimes the cameras get a little weird on me. If you have like a layer selected and you start adding things to your scene, it'll add it in that layer, which can just, I don't know, sometimes it just makes things messy. But you'll notice that we have, again, camera 2 is rendering from camera 1, frames 4 to 6. The layer cam 1 is rendering frames 1 to 3 from the perspective camera. If you look at the master layer, it's just doing whatever random stuff it was doing before. We've not changed any of those settings. So this should be good to render after you do one more thing. Does anyone have any questions on what I did so far? All right. So what you want to do before you render usually is go through. I'm gonna unexpand all of these. So right now we're looking at our master layer. It doesn't really matter which layer you're looking at when you go to render. But what you want to pay attention to is these little like render, whatever, slapboard things, whatever they're called, that are highlighted blue. If it's highlighted blue, when you hit batch render, it will render that layer. And in this case, we don't really want to render the master layer. Presumably that's not really doing anything. It's just sort of the layer that we work in. So if you want that to not render, or you only want to render a specific layer, make sure that, again, anything you don't want to render, you uncheck that little blue button. At that point, you should be good to go up and do just like a batch render or whatever like you do normally. And this is going to dump everything in my default project folder and make me sad. But it should go through, and it actually does a very, for once, convenient and intuitive thing where it will just sort of make a folder for all of your different render layers. This is the demo I did from yesterday. But it's just going to make a different layer for that, or a little folder, and put all of your little renders in here. So gorgeous. So it's going to go through, it's going to render camera 1, and it's going to move on to camera 2. And in this case, this is like my extra stuff from yesterday in here. And you can see, so it's doing frames 4, 5, and 6. Oof. Whereas the other one, and it's rendering from camera 1. So if you ever do just need to set up like a giant batch render, that is one way to do it. Does that make sense? Are there any questions on that? Cool. So like I said, I'll probably go over like 1 or 2 more things you can do with render layers. I use them a lot to make sort of fake green screens for things, or like temporarily assign alternative textures to things. It's just a convenient, organized way to do that. But that is actually all the stuff I had for you today. Are there any other questions? Okay. All right, in that case, the rest of the class I'm just going to open up to be open lab. I'm not going to do the thing where I like sort of go around for 7 minutes